This week is an incredible week for me in many ways. I've had the opportunity earlier in this week to speak at our Synod to put forward a motion giving thanks for the life of Archdeacon Jarrett. And today I'm here speaking about Deaconess Margaret Rodgers, and I feel like, here I am following in the footsteps of these two amazing servants in our diocese, and what a privilege it is to speak about them. Let me tell you a little bit about Margaret's life in the Synod and serving on standing committee. On Tuesday, the 18th of October 2011, the following motion was presented to the Sydney Synod. It read, "Synod gives thanks for the ministry of Deaconess Margaret Rodgers, who retired from Synod last year, and in particular her distinguished presence on the floor of Synod for over 30 years, her long-standing membership of standing committee, her service to the General Synod as a diocesan representative since 1979, serving both on its standing committee and the international committees, including her time as the General Synod Research Officer, her commitment to the training of women in ministry through Deaconess House as tutor, vice principal, and finally principal from 1976 to 85, her professional expertise in media relations, becoming the first CEO of Anglican Media and then the Archbishop's media officer in those years, and finally her unwavering commitment to Christ in the service of others for over 40 years as a deaconess. And then Synod expressed its gratitude to Margaret and wished her God's blessings upon her future life and ministry. I think this motion summarises her contribution as one of the key women in the life of the diocese in the many different spheres of governance and the oversight that she moved in, not only in the Diocese of Sydney, of course, but also in the National Church. I remember meeting Margaret when she was the media officer for the Archbishop. It was my first and I think only meeting with her, as my time as a Merredin girl did not overlap with her years as a teacher there. The year I met her was 2007. I was in fourth year at college, and I was writing a church history paper on the training of women in the Sydney Diocese in the 1960s. And Christine, you and I had an interview, you may not remember, but I remember sitting down with you and interviewing you and Narelle and some other women who were trained at Deaconess House during those years. And as we've heard, Margaret completed her Diploma of Theology with first-class honours at Deaconess House in 1963 before going on to further study. She knew a thing or two because of her ministry and leadership of Deaconess House. She knew a thing or two about the training of women in our diocese. Again, I don't remember a lot of that meeting, but I do remember being quite nervous sitting in her office, knowing that she was an accomplished leader in the diocese, me, a mere college student, thinking, I hope she doesn't eat me alive from my questions. She was very gracious and very kind to me. Yet while she held an unwavering commitment to women being trained and deployed in ministry across the diocese, she was also clearly skilled in leadership through committee work. I don't know if she enjoyed it. Maybe some of those in this room will know that more than I. But the number of committees on which she served surely meant that she had some natural inclination to want to contribute in this way. Margaret's contribution to governance and the life of the diocese and national church is extraordinary, as we've already heard. And I think there are few, apart from our most senior lay leaders, who have served in such extensive ways. I'm going to consider some of the ways she did that. And firstly, thinking about the local church and her appointment to Synod and Standing Committee. Now, as she began her leadership at Deaconess House as principal, she also joined the Sydney Synod as a lay representative of the Newtown parish, where she went to church. It's unclear if she began her time on Synod in 1976 or 1977 because she was replacing somebody who had been appointed for the 75 to 77 triennium. And anyway, she was replacing that person. But she remained on Synod until 2011, some 35 years. We have just finished this year's Synod, 2 weeks. I have no real inclination to remain on that body for another however many years. I don't want to be a member for that long, I don't think. Throughout her time at Synod, as a Synod rep, she also stood and was elected, as we've heard, as both church warden and parish councillor of the parish of Newtown, Erskineville. She only finished on parish council a year before her death. Extraordinary. Upon her death, an article written for the Diocese magazine Southern Cross, Bishop Glenn Davies, here in the room today, mentioned that the local church was of vital importance to Margaret, not just in attending to governance matters. Dr. David Honey, a member of the Moore College faculty and a long-term member of Newtown Parish, when I spoke to him recently, he remembers her ability, and it seems to me this fits with the general profile we've been given of Margaret today. He remembers her ability to, in his words, dissect the sermons of young student ministers from Moore College. Her theological mind always applied to the training and formation of future ministers. While Margaret would be one of several, but still significantly minority women at Synod, it was her election to standing committee that made her the first woman to participate in that arena. This is an extract here from the Synod papers in 1978, where a vacancy for the lay member of Synod was declared and Bishop Cameron nominated Deaconess Rodgers. Her first meeting, though, wasn't until 1979, 19th of February. There she is in the minutes among a number of people. Canon D.B. Knox was absent that meeting, but you can see there she is, her first meeting, February 1979, on standing committee. And again, she remained on that committee until 2011. And in many ways, that fact is extremely important in understanding Margaret's place in the diocese. The phrase, as Peter used earlier, a woman in a man's world, seems totally apt at this point. Bishop Davies recalls Deaconess Rodgers, and in his words, certainly held her own among the cut and thrust of debate in standing committee. He also recalls that Margaret first used the fact that she was in the minority as a woman to her advantage, and he says, often starting her speeches with the phrase, "I know I'm only a woman, but..." or words to that effect anyway. He says, she was a formidable speaker in Synod. Her speeches carried weight. She understood the Synod procedure and used it to her advantage. Dr. Robert Tong, who we've heard has put that sheet together earlier, he said she certainly wasn't backward in coming forward. And I think these phrases all continue to paint that picture that we've already heard today of Margaret's activity and the way she carried herself in the diocese. But of course, as Peter said, the man's world she inhabited was a Christian world, a gospel-hearted and minded world. But that doesn't discount the need for a woman in this context to have a particular strength of character and mind. It appears from all reports that Deaconess Margaret Rodgers was both highly capable and a keen contributor in debates. Dr. Karen Sawada said in her article in the Sydney Morning Herald in July 2014, after Margaret's death, early on, Rodgers was often the only woman in a room of men, but she was not intimidated. Indeed, her very presence opened the door for many to follow. So her pioneering work that we heard about earlier, I think, is part of that is her presence in this kind of committee area. For the next few minutes, I want to focus on some contributions Margaret made in the areas of Synod. And the first is the Doctrine Commission. You'll see the motion there, 1981. It was Deaconess Margaret Rodgers who moved the motion at Synod to establish what I think is an extremely significant group in the life of our diocese. With about 10 members, it meets each month to prepare theological papers in response to issues referred to it by the Synod or the Archbishop. And it was Margaret who moved this motion. As we noted earlier, she graduated with distinction from her theological studies, and it made her suitably qualified to be appointed as one of the founding members of this Doctrine Commission, serving for about 10 years. And during her time on the Commission, it produced several reports, particularly on the ordination of women, remarriage of divorced people, the ministry of women and diaconal presidency, to name just a few. Margaret was very involved in significant issues in the life of the diocese, and sitting on this commission she would have made an incredible contribution, I imagine. As we know, the ordination of women to the diaconate took place in the Sydney Diocese in 1989, right in the middle of Margaret's time on the commission. Despite the 89 ruling, as we've already discussed, Margaret herself did not pursue ordination to the diaconate. She was committed to remaining a deaconess all of her life. While Margaret's name was beside the motion, I guess it would be true to say that the idea of the commission was not hers alone, and perhaps there are others in the room that would know more about this than me. But from my understanding of how Synod works and how Standing Committee works and all of these processes, a move of the motion, I imagine, would have been in discussion with many others at this point, especially establishing such an important body. I take it she probably would have been in conversation with the Archbishop of the day, perhaps the Principal of Moore College, or other people. I doubt, well, maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt this was just an idea that she developed herself and then put forward to Synod, though from what we've heard earlier today, maybe it wouldn't surprise us if that was the case. But I suspect she came to this with the help of others. Over her time in the Synod, she moved about 20 different motions or reports in the life of the Synod. Not all were controversial or of such great significance as the Doctrine Commission, such as the motion respectfully asking the Archbishop of the day to send Christian greetings from the Synod to Archbishop Marcus Loane on the occasion of his 92nd birthday. Not his 90th, not his 90th, his 92nd birthday. Or perhaps the question she asked about whether there was a more expedient way to handle questions and answers at the Synod. I think the way we do the question time even today is partly a fruit of that kind of question that she herself asked many years ago. Or perhaps the motion that she moved in 1980, which has affected my life in the last 2 weeks. My whole last 2 weeks has been shaped by this very motion. That is, that Synod does not meet before 3:15 each day, and that ordinances are not taken before 4:30. Our Synod still operates on those procedures even today. This is the kind of influence she had. But there are other motions that betrayed, I think, a deep sense of her commitment to both good and significant areas of social justice. And as we've focused on her life today, I think this is probably the area, an interesting column where you mentioned she wasn't mentioned in that book about significant deaconesses because perhaps her work as a deaconess didn't fit the true mould. Yet she moved so many motions at Synod about issues of social justice. For example, in 1995, she moved a motion about noting the opening of the Sydney Harbour Casino and getting Synod to reaffirm its opposition to casinos, asking the Social Issues Committee and the Home Mission Society to monitor the impact of this casino on our community life, to evaluate research, to report back to Synod and suggest strategies for ministry to the victims of gambling and their families. I think that shows a deep concern for the life of the vulnerable. She also moved a motion in 1996 regarding euthanasia legislation, which is really interesting given that in a couple of months the voluntary assisted dying work will be enabled in New South Wales. But here she is again leading the way in these areas of social justice. She also moved motions regarding prayers for the end of violence in Israel, Jerusalem and the West Bank, opposition to embryonic stem cell research, a motion regarding the war in Iraq in the 1990s, and care of people with disabilities. She had a deep passion for the vulnerable, and that was expressed in a way that, in an arena in which she had deep influence, that is through the Synod and the Standing Committee. So I find Margaret's work extraordinary in its variety of concern, in its variety of interest, that she used the place she had in the diocese, a unique place for a woman like her, to promote areas of care and support for often people that would be overlooked. Let me move on to another area that she was invested in, and that is Holy Communion. She moved two motions concerning the administration of Holy Communion, first in 1990 in response to the comments from the Archbishop Robinson's presidential address, and you can see that there. The other was in 1993 when she and Bishop Glenn Davies were the catalysts for the Doctrine Commission report, which would re-examine the issue of whether children should be permitted to receive Holy Communion before they were confirmed. A very delicate and I suggest controversial thing in the diocese at the time. And if they were, then to decide whether the diocese would be willing to adopt a general synod canon relating to this matter. This is where things get incredibly complex in our synod and governance life, and yet Margaret was available and keen to support the changes that she felt were required. In 1997, the canon was adopted by the Sydney Synod, in part because of Margaret and Bishop Glenn's work. Though I do say this quite nervously with Bishop Glenn in the room, that it was adopted despite the fact it seems the Doctrine Commission was not overwhelmingly swayed by his article that he'd written for the Reformed Theological Review on this matter. But you might disagree with that.
They've probably changed their mind by now.
Yeah, that's right. So it once again, just showing the diversity of areas that Margaret took a keen interest in the life of the diocese. But let me talk about women in ministry, because that has been a specific area that we've highlighted. The final area of Margaret's work on Synod is a couple of motions. These couple of motions I want to focus on. Take them in chronological order, and I think they show a deep concern and conviction about the place of women in the diocese. We've talked about parish sisters and deaconesses before, and in 1977 you see this motion before you, superannuation for parish sisters. At that time, they weren't part of the compulsory superannuation contributions for women in the diocese, and this motion is clearly one to support and make provision for their future. The diocese had legislated superannuation for clergy since 1906 and 1961, and that was, in 1961, it was broadened to include deaconesses, which was fantastic. But the parish sisters weren't included, and Margaret wanted to ensure that those women who are also licensed throughout the diocese would be supported. The records show that this motion was passed and an amendment was made to the ordinance the following year. But the second one was in 2008. It's an interesting motion to move because I don't think there was anything particular going on, controversially at least, for women at that time in the diocese. I remember having just finished at college, serving in the local church, and Narelle Jarrett had just begun full-time as the Archdeacon for Women's Ministry. So really this seems to be a call to arms in many ways, to continue to consider how to raise up and deploy women for ministry across the diocese. And while Margaret was leading this motion, I think what we're missing as we read these excerpts from both Synod and Standing Committee, as we read all the other motions that she's had her name against, what we miss here is her voice. What we don't hear is the way that she may have passionately defended or spoken to these matters. We don't hear the arguments in debate that she would have had. We don't have the recordings of the speeches or the sense of urging or pleading that may have gone alongside them. I imagine as in the Synod, when you stand, if you want to speak in a debate, I imagine as Margaret may have stood at many times during many different debates, I imagine it would be to the peril of the president, the Archbishop at the time, to ignore her. And so I imagine she would have been called upon quite often to speak in various matters. And while we don't also have the record of how often she spoke, but I can just picture it, and I can imagine some in the room or some online who are part of those debates would have seen her be a constant contributor to the life of the diocese. I won't speak about her ministry beyond the diocese. I think Rod's going to do that for us in a few minutes. But just some final words. That's her life beyond the Synod. Just some final words. This is the end of the motion. And again, one thing right at the beginning, you may have noticed, it talked about her retirement, her beginning Standing Committee in 1982, but we know from our records that was a much earlier date. But the final clause of the motion presented to the Synod says, Synod is giving thanks for her unwavering commitment to Christ in the service of others for over 40 years as a deaconess. For all the years of recording minutes, sitting in committee meetings, listening and contributing to debates, listening to those she agreed and disagreed with, Margaret in the end was known for her unwavering commitment to Christ. It was her Lord she was serving as she joined these groups. Her calling as deaconess and her obvious leadership skills allowed her to participate in significant ways, guiding the activities of the diocese and guarding the gospel. We give thanks for her service in this way because it clearly made such an incredible contribution to the life of this diocese.